In this lesson, we'll go over the basics of running containers with the docker run command. We know that docker run takes at minimum one argument, which is either the image name or the image ID. Let's run a plain Ubuntu container by specifying just the image name. Even if you don't have the Ubuntu image cached locally, Docker will download it from Docker Hub automatically. That didn't do much since the Ubuntu image defines bash as its default command. We can override the command by adding another argument. This short-lived container simply ran the ls command. Any additional arguments after the overridden command are passed as arguments to the command, so we can do something like this. Any number of arguments can be passed in the command arguments. So next, let's revisit our Hello O'Reilly HTTP service container. Since the Hello O'Reilly HTTP container runs a web server, our container is longer lived. Let's run our Hello O'Reilly image using docker run. We've seen this before. We started our HTTP service inside a container in the foreground, which is why we can see the standard out. This isn't really an ideal way to run a container, because the process will end and the container will exit if I close my terminal or press Ctrl-C. In most production scenarios, we want our containers to run as background processes. We can do this using the detach parameter, or -d. Let's stop our container using Ctrl-C and restart it detached. Instead of seeing standard out, we now just see a container ID as the output. If we wanted to execute any other actions on this container, we could reference it using this ID. And now that we have a running container, we can see it running using docker ps, which will list all running containers. Seldom does the output of docker ps fit in a single line, but it's pretty clear what this output means. The first column is the container ID, which is unique to this specific container instance. Next is the image that the container is created from, which is of course my Hello O'Reilly HTTP image. The next column is the container's command. We didn't specify a command when we ran this container because it defines an entry point. Containers created from images with an entry point do not require a command to be specified in the docker run command. We will discuss entry point in a later chapter. Next is the time the container was created and the status of the container. We didn't map any ports to the Docker host on this container, but if we had, we'd see the mappings here. We can see that 4567 is exposed inside the container. Finally, we see the name of our container. A container can be referenced either by its image ID or its name, and if you don't explicitly name a container, Docker will give it a cute randomly generated one. Let's stop our container and then start a new one with a specified name. We can stop a container using docker stop. Notice that I didn't type the full ID of the container. You can usually get away with typing 3 or 4 characters if there aren't a ton of containers running. If you only type a small number of characters and there's multiple containers with the same first few characters in their ID, Docker will fail the command. We've stopped our container. We can see stopped containers by executing docker ps with the -a flag. There's our stopped container. Let's start a new named container. We can give a container a name using the name flag. This docker run command will create a new Hello O'Reilly HTTP container with the name hello_container1. Now that it's started, we can see our name when we run docker ps. Names are useful if you're running a lot of the same image on a Docker host, or if you're using a bridged network, as containers use names to communicate. We'll discuss this more when we talk about networking. We can also restart containers using docker restart. Let's restart our HTTP service container. Restart takes either a container ID, or in our case, a container name as a parameter. Pretty straightforward. We'll cover the container lifecycle in more detail in a later lesson.